January 17th, 1945. The Philippine Sea. The sun hammered down on the steel deck of the USS Lexington like a forge hammer on an anvil. Commander Takeo Shibata stood on the bridge of the captured Japanese destroyer Hatsuzaki, now under American control, his white naval uniform stained with salt spray and the dust of defeat. Through cracked binoculars, he watched something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not the carriers that had crushed his fleet, not the endless waves of American aircraft that had turned the sky into a metal storm, but something far more incomprehensible. A barge, painted navy gray, was making its way between the massive warships of Task Force 38. On its deck, American sailors lined up with bowls in hand, laughing, shouting over the engine noise. They were being served ice cream in the middle of the Pacific, in the middle of a war that had consumed 50 million lives. Shibata lowered his binoculars slowly. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the collision of two realities that could not coexist in the same universe. For 3 years, he had eaten weevil-infested rice and dried fish that tasted like cardboard soaked in brine. He had watched his own men grow hollow-eyed and skeletal, their ribs pressing against skin like bamboo cages. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the Pacific, had been reduced to scavenging, rationing, praying that supply ships might make it through the American submarine nets. And here, in the same ocean where Japanese sailors drank brackish water and gnawed on moldy hardtack, the Americans were serving frozen dessert from a dedicated vessel whose sole purpose was to manufacture pleasure. He turned to the American liaison officer standing beside him, a young lieutenant from Iowa with an easy smile and eyes that had never known hunger. "That ship," Shibata said in careful English, each word weighted with disbelief. "What is its function?" The lieutenant glanced at the barge, then back at Shibata with genuine confusion, as if the question itself made no sense. "Oh, that's just the ice cream barge, sir. Comes around every few days. Keeps morale up." He said it the way one might describe a mail delivery or weather report, mundane, unremarkable, ordinary. Shibata said nothing more. What could he say? How could he explain to this boy from Iowa that the ship he called just an ice cream barge represented something more terrifying than any battleship, more devastating than any bombing raid? It was proof of an industrial capacity so vast, so incomprehensibly abundant, that America could dedicate resources, steel, fuel, manpower, and engineering genius to the mass production of frozen dessert, while simultaneously building the largest military force the world had ever seen. The lieutenant walked away, whistling something cheerful and American. Shibata stood alone on the deck, staring at that gray barge, understanding with perfect clarity that Japan had never stood a chance. They had been fighting an enemy from another civilization entirely. This was not a revelation born in the moment. It was the culmination of a slow, agonizing awakening that had begun years earlier, whispered about in officers' clubs and administrative offices from Tokyo to Truk, dismissed as propaganda, as exaggeration, as the desperate lies of a losing side. But it was true. All of it was true. The Americans had not merely built ice cream barges. They had constructed an entire floating factory. The USS Lexington's onboard ice cream parlor could produce 10 gallons every 7 minutes. They had designed concrete barges, refrigerated and motorized, capable of storing 2,000 gallons of ice cream and traveling between fleet positions. In 1945 alone, the U.S. Navy would produce over 5 million gallons of ice cream for its Pacific forces. The numbers were so absurd, they seemed fictional. But Commander Shibata had seen it with his own eyes, and the sight had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the war. of his nation's chances, of reality itself. The story of these ice cream ships did not begin in 1945. It began in the mind of a culture that treated abundance as a birthright and comfort as a strategic asset. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, its naval leadership believed they were facing a wealthy but soft opponent, a nation grown decadent on luxury, whose fighting spirit had been eroded by democracy and materialism. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and understood America better than most of his colleagues, had warned that Japan was awakening a sleeping giant. But even Yamamoto could not have imagined the specific form the giant would take. The United States did not simply mobilize its military, it mobilized its entire civilization. And that civilization had been built on principles that were alien to the Japanese warrior tradition: mass production, standardization, efficiency, and the radical idea that the common soldier deserved not just survival, but comfort. In August 1942, just 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy established its Bureau of Supplies and Accounts Directive, requiring that ice cream be made available to all naval personnel in combat zones, wherever feasible. This was not a frivolous luxury. It was strategic doctrine. American military planners had studied troop morale with scientific rigor and concluded that small comforts, hot showers, decent food, entertainment, and yes, ice cream, dramatically improved fighting effectiveness, reduced psychological casualties, and maintained unit cohesion over extended deployments. The Japanese Naval Code emphasized spiritual strength and the samurai virtue of enduring hardship without complaint. The American Code emphasized logistics, supply chains, and the belief that well-fed, comfortable troops fought harder and longer than starving, miserable ones. History would prove which philosophy was correct. By 1943, the U.S. Navy's supply infrastructure in the Pacific had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. It was not simply a logistics network. It was a floating industrial civilization capable of projecting not just military power, but an entire standard of living across thousands of miles of ocean. The ice cream program was merely the most visible and psychologically devastating example. At the Philadelphia Navy Yard, engineers designed and constructed the world's first ice cream barge, a concrete vessel, since steel was needed for warships, measuring 40 feet long and equipped with refrigeration units capable of producing 2,000 gallons of ice cream in a single production run. It could serve up to 3,000 men per day. The barge was so successful that the Navy immediately ordered more. By war's end, floating ice cream factories operated throughout the Pacific, from the Philippines to Okinawa, from Pearl Harbor to the Mariana Islands. But the ice cream ships were merely the surface of something deeper and more profound. In March 1944, Japanese intelligence officers analyzing captured American supply manifests discovered something that their superiors initially refused to believe. The documents showed that American ships were stocked with fresh fruit, canned vegetables, frozen meat, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, chewing gum, and candy bars. The variety and quantity of food available to American enlisted men exceeded what most Japanese officers received. One captured manifest from a destroyer escort, a minor vessel in the American fleet, listed menu options including roast turkey, baked ham, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread, butter, milk, pie, and cake, for a single meal for enlisted sailors. Lieutenant Yoshio Kodama, an intelligence officer assigned to analyze American supply chains, brought these documents to his commanding officer in disbelief. "Sir, this cannot be accurate. These quantities would suggest that American supply ships dedicate more cargo space to food variety than to ammunition." His commander studied the documents silently for several minutes before responding. "It is accurate. We have verified it through multiple sources. This is how they operate." Kodama felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "But sir, our men receive 800 grams of rice and perhaps some dried fish. The Americans are eating like emperors." "Not like emperors," his commander corrected quietly. "Like Americans. This is their normal standard. This is what their civilization considers adequate for common soldiers." The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the Japanese officer corps like a seismic wave. It was one thing to face an enemy with more ships and more planes. It was another thing entirely to face an enemy whose baseline standard of living for its lowest enlisted man exceeded what your own elite forces could dream of. The ice cream was not a luxury. It was a statement. It said, "We are so wealthy, so powerful, so industrially advanced, that we can provide frozen dessert in tropical combat zones as a routine service. What else might we be capable of?" The answer to that question was emerging across the Pacific in ways that defied Japanese comprehension. In July 1944, the USS Lexington, one of America's Essex-class carriers, installed a fully functional ice cream parlor below decks. It was not a small operation. The facility could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, in multiple flavors: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, pineapple, served to crew members between flight operations. The ship's newspaper, published daily and distributed throughout the vessel, included a comic strip, movie reviews, and the ice cream parlor's daily menu. A Japanese officer who examined these newspapers after the war would later write, "Reading these documents was more demoralizing than any battle report. They revealed an enemy who treated war as an industrial project requiring worker satisfaction metrics, not a spiritual test of national will." But perhaps most devastating was what happened when American forces captured Japanese bases and the defenders saw American supply operations firsthand. When U.S. Marines secured Saipan in July 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians retreated into the island's caves and jungles. Many remained hidden for weeks, watching the Americans. What they saw transformed their understanding of the war more completely than any propaganda could have achieved. They watched Americans unload supplies from ships, not just ammunition and weapons, but crate after crate of food, medical supplies, construction materials, and equipment. They watched Navy Seabees construct air bases in days, complete with paved runways, control towers, and barracks. They watched refrigerated trucks deliver fresh provisions to field kitchens. They watched Americans play baseball in their downtime, listen to music on portable radios, and drink Coca-Cola in the heat. One Japanese soldier who surrendered wrote in his diary, "I emerged from the jungle expecting to join my brothers in the afterlife, prepared for death by starvation. Instead, I was given food that I did not recognize, treated by doctors, and held in a camp where prisoners received 3 full meals daily. I ate more in my first week of captivity than in my last month of service." This was not a war between armies. It was a war between centuries, between worlds. We were samurai with swords facing men with machine guns. No, it was worse than that. We were samurai with swords facing men with machine guns who stopped at noon for ice cream. The symbolism was inescapable. Ice cream, cold, sweet, requiring complex refrigeration technology and continuous supply chains, something utterly unnecessary for survival, became the perfect metaphor for American power. It represented surplus, abundance, the capacity to provide comfort in the midst of chaos. It was democracy made tangible, the idea that even common sailors deserved small luxuries, that morale mattered as much as munitions, that the fighting man was not just a tool, but a citizen whose well-being was a national priority. The Japanese military philosophy had no category for this kind of warfare. Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized austerity, sacrifice, and spiritual strength through suffering. Japanese soldiers were taught to endure hardship as a virtue, to view comfort as weakness, to embrace death before dishonor. These were not empty slogans. They were lived principles that produced soldiers of extraordinary courage and determination. But courage cannot defeat industrial capacity. Determination cannot compete with refrigeration technology. Spiritual strength means nothing when your supply ships are sunk by submarines and your men are eating tree bark while the enemy enjoys butter pecan. By late 1944, Japanese officers were experiencing a collective psychological crisis that would rarely be discussed in post-war accounts. The crisis was not born from defeat in battle. Samurai tradition provided a framework for honorable death in combat. The crisis came from the realization that they had fundamentally misunderstood their opponent's nature. They had prepared to fight a war of will and found themselves in a war of industrial mathematics. They had expected American forces to crack under pressure, to reveal the softness that luxury supposedly breeds. Instead, they discovered that well-fed, well-supplied soldiers fight harder, last longer, and maintain cohesion far better than starving warriors sustained only by ideology. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war, would later write, "We believed that Americans were weak because they valued comfort. We did not understand that their comfort was not a weakness, but a foundation. We starved our soldiers to make them strong. They fed theirs to make them effective. We built our strategy on spirit. They built theirs on steel and ice cream." History shows which approach was superior. The ice cream ships became legendary among Japanese forces. Rumors spread about the floating factories, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some said the Americans had entire ships dedicated to entertainment, with movie theaters and dance halls. Some claimed American soldiers received steak every Sunday and fresh fruit every day. These rumors were dismissed by Japanese command as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize troops. But they were not propaganda. If anything, the reality was more extraordinary than the rumors. In October 1944, the U.S. Navy commissioned a specialized vessel known as a refrigerated supply ship, essentially a floating warehouse dedicated entirely to food storage and distribution. These ships carried no weapons, only food. Each could supply an entire fleet with frozen meat, fresh vegetables, dairy products, and yes, the raw materials for ice cream production. The ships were so valuable that they traveled under destroyer escort, protected as carefully as ammunition carriers. Think about that for a moment. America built unarmed ships dedicated solely to transporting food luxury items, and then assigned military resources to protect them, because maintaining troop morale through proper diet was considered as strategically important as maintaining ammunition supplies. Japanese military doctrine had no equivalent concept. Supply ships carried rice, dried fish, and ammunition. The idea of dedicating cargo space to variety in diet, to comfort, to anything beyond basic caloric survival, was alien to military thinking shaped by scarcity and samurai tradition. This was not a moral failing or a lack of care for soldiers. It was a reflection of economic reality. Japan was a resource-poor island nation fighting a war across thousands of miles of ocean against an enemy that controlled the world's largest industrial economy. There was no surplus. There was barely enough. Every grain of rice mattered. Every gallon of fuel was precious. The idea of wasting any resources on something as frivolous as frozen dessert was not just impractical. It was incomprehensible. But that incomprehension was itself the problem. The Americans were not wasting resources. They were demonstrating that they had so many resources that they could afford to allocate some to comfort without diminishing their military capacity. The ice cream was not waste, it was surplus, and surplus is the ultimate expression of power. Any nation can arm its soldiers. Only a truly wealthy nation can arm them and give them ice cream. The transformation in Japanese military thinking happened slowly, privately, in conversations that would never appear in official reports. Officers who had spent their careers believing in spiritual strength over material wealth found their certainties crumbling. They had been taught that Western decadence would be the Allies' undoing, that democracy made nations soft, that luxury bred weakness. Every ice cream barge that appeared in the Pacific disproved these teachings. Every captured supply manifest revealed an enemy who combined military ferocity with civilized comfort, who could be utterly ruthless in combat and then serve frozen dessert in the same afternoon. In February 1945, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, a wounded Japanese officer was evacuated from the island by American forces after being found in a cave system. He was taken aboard a hospital ship where he received surgery, antibiotics, and careful nursing care. When he regained consciousness, a medic asked him what he wanted to eat. The officer, assuming this was some kind of psychological test or mockery, said he had no preferences. The medic brought him a menu, an actual printed menu with options. The officer stared at it for several minutes, unable to process what he was seeing. He chose soup, something simple. The medic returned with the soup, crackers, juice, and a small cup of vanilla ice cream. For after, the medic explained with a smile, everyone gets dessert. The officer ate the ice cream slowly, mechanically. It was the first cold thing he had consumed in 3 years that was not rainwater. It tasted like nothing he remembered. When the medic left, the officer wept quietly in his bed, not from pain or fear or even grief, but from the sudden, crushing understanding that his nation had sent him to die in a war it could never win, against an enemy that could afford to give ice cream to its prisoners. This was the horror that Japanese officers grappled with in private, not the physical horror of battle, which they had been trained to endure, but the existential horror of understanding that the entire ideological framework of their military culture was built on false assumptions. They had been told that Western materialism was spiritual corruption, that comfort made men weak, that only through hardship could true strength emerge. But here was an enemy made strong by comfort, made dangerous by abundance, made victorious by logistics that included frozen dessert in tropical war zones. The ice cream ships forced a question that Japanese military philosophy could not answer. What if comfort and strength were not opposites? What if treating soldiers as valuable individuals rather than expendable tools actually produced better fighters? What if democracy's emphasis on individual well-being was not a weakness, but a strategic advantage? The American military operated on the radical principle that every soldier mattered as an individual, that his morale and health and even his small pleasures were worth national investment. This was not just generosity. It was cold strategic calculation. Happy soldiers fight better. Healthy soldiers last longer. Well-supplied troops maintain discipline and cohesion. The ice cream was not kindness. It was warfare by other means. By mid-1945, as Japan's situation grew increasingly desperate, the contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity reached surreal extremes. American naval forces conducted operations from bases where fresh water flowed freely, where electric lights illuminated barracks, where refrigeration preserved food and kept medicines viable. Japanese forces on bypassed islands drank from stagnant pools, fought tropical diseases with no medicine, and ate whatever they could find: leaves, insects, bark from trees. On Guam, a captured Japanese soldier was given his first American military meal: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and cake. He ate in silence, then asked through a translator if this was how American prisoners were fed. No, he was told. This was how American soldiers were fed. The prisoner nodded slowly, understanding in that moment why his country was losing. The ice cream symbolism extended beyond military personnel. In the islands that American forces recaptured, Guam, Saipan, the Philippines, civilian populations encountered American supply chains for the first time. Children who had been taught that Americans were devils discovered that these devils brought medicine, food, and on special occasions, ice cream. The contrast with Japanese occupation, which had been characterized by harsh military rule and resource extraction, was stark and immediate. Democracy, these civilians learned, tasted like cold vanilla on a hot afternoon. Freedom arrived in refrigerated barges. This was psychological warfare at its most profound level, though it was never intended as such. The Americans were not trying to demoralize their enemies with ice cream. They were simply maintaining the standard of living they considered normal. But that normality was itself devastating to Japanese morale. It revealed the vast gulf between the two nations' capabilities, the impossible distance between their industrial capacities, the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. Japan had entered the war, believing it could compensate for material disadvantage with spiritual superiority. The ice cream ships proved that no amount of spirit could overcome a certain threshold of material disparity. Commander Shibata, standing on that deck in January 1945, watching American sailors line up for frozen dessert, understood all of this in a single moment of crystalline clarity. He understood that his Navy had not merely lost battles. It had lost a competition between civilizations, between philosophies, between different visions of what a society owed its citizens. Japan had mobilized for total war, demanding every sacrifice, rationing every resource, treating its soldiers as tools to be used and discarded. America had mobilized for total war while somehow maintaining the principle that its soldiers deserved comfort, variety, small pleasures, ice cream on a hot day. And America was winning. The war would end 7 months later with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, weapons so powerful they seemed to belong to science fiction. But for many Japanese officers, the ice cream ships were more psychologically devastating than the bombs. The atomic weapons were apocalyptic, beyond comprehension, something new in human history. The ice cream was mundane, comprehensible, routine, and therefore far more terrifying. It said, "This is normal for us. This is our baseline. Imagine what else we can do." In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became one of the world's wealthiest nations, those officers who had seen the ice cream ships would remember them as the moment they understood the true nature of American power. Not the carriers or the bombers or the submarines, though those were devastating. The ice cream, the casual, routine, unremarkable provision of frozen dessert to common sailors in the middle of the world's largest war. That was the image that haunted them, because it revealed a civilization operating on principles they had been taught to despise but could not defeat. The ice cream ships were never famous in America. They did not receive headlines or medals. No monuments were built to honor their service. They were footnotes in supply records, curiosities in military history, the kind of detail that appears in specialized books and nowhere else. But to those who witnessed them from the other side, they were symbols of something vast and incomprehensible. A nation so wealthy that it could treat war itself as just another industrial problem to be solved with efficiency, resources, and a commitment to keeping its workers satisfied. This was the genius of American democracy, translated into military doctrine. The belief that individuals matter, that their comfort and morale are worth investment, that a well-treated citizen soldier is worth more than 100 brutalized conscripts. The ice cream was not a luxury. It was a statement of values, a declaration that American civilization could wage total war without abandoning the principle that human dignity and small pleasures were worth preserving even in the midst of chaos and death. Commander Shibata would live until 1992, long enough to see Japan become an economic superpower, long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in prosperity that would have seemed impossible in 1945. But he never forgot that moment on the deck, watching the ice cream barge make its rounds. In interviews late in his life, he would describe it as the moment he understood that Japan had lost not just a war, but an argument about what civilization should be. "We believed that strength came from denial," he said. "They proved that strength could come from abundance. We starved our men to make them warriors. They fed theirs to make them victorious." History chose between these philosophies, and history chose ice cream. The story of the ice cream ships is not a story about dessert. It is a story about the nature of power, about the relationship between civilization and military strength, about what it means for a democracy to wage war without becoming tyrannical. The United States did not win World War II solely because of ice cream barges, any more than it won because of any single weapon or strategy. It won because it had built a society capable of producing vast abundance, and that abundance extended from factories to fields to floating freezers in the Pacific. It won because it believed that treating its citizens well, even its citizen soldiers in combat zones, was not a weakness, but a foundation of strength. In the end, the ice cream ships were proof of a simple truth that authoritarian regimes have always struggled to accept. Free people, properly cared for and confident in their society's commitment to their well-being, fight harder and more effectively than brutalized subjects driven by fear and propaganda. Democracy is not weak because it values comfort. Democracy is strong because it has the surplus to provide comfort while still projecting overwhelming force. The ice cream was not a distraction from war. It was an expression of the same industrial and organizational capacity that built the ships and planes and bombs that won the war. When Japanese officers saw those ice cream barges, they were seeing the physical manifestation of a civilization that had solved problems their own society was still struggling with. Mass production, efficient logistics, resource abundance, and the revolutionary idea that ordinary people deserved more than mere survival. They were seeing their own defeat made tangible in frozen vanilla, their ideology refuted by refrigeration technology, their warrior tradition rendered obsolete by a nation that could afford to be both ruthlessly effective in combat and casually generous with dessert. The ice cream ships sailed through the Pacific for less than 3 years, a tiny footnote in a vast war. But they represented something timeless and profound: the power of surplus, the strength of abundance, and the ultimate victory of a civilization that believed its common citizens deserved ice cream, even in hell. That belief, more than any weapon, more than any strategy, was what won the war. The ice cream was never just dessert. It was democracy served cold.